Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your guest host today, Steve Francisco, and it's a real pleasure for me to welcome a very special guest today. Jon Pratt is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits based in St. Paul. He's also a former colleague of mine as I worked at the Council of Nonprofits with the Minnesota Budget Project for 7 years. Jon, welcome to Access to Democracy.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Since this is your first time, tell our viewers a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school?
I grew up in Anoka. I graduated from Anoka High School 10 years after Garrison Keillor and 5 years before Michelle Bachmann. And went to St. Olaf College, went to law school in D.C., and then came back to Minnesota and worked for Minnesota Public Interest Research Group as a attorney lobbyist.
Known as, some people call it MPIRG,
yes.
Right? And that's the organization that many of us, when we were students at the U in the 1970s, a part of our student fees went to help pay for MPIRG.
Yeah, and for many students that was their first sort of nonprofit involvement. So, and when I was a student at St. Olaf, I was also, and that's where I met my wife, Deb Clemenson, was in MPIRG, and I think, like many other people at that time, really became interested in the nonprofit sector and how nonprofits are part of the economy and a part of how people get things done.
And I've always thought one of the more interesting parts of your biography is that in 1982, 30 years ago, you managed a campaign, a political campaign, of someone who went on to achieve some notoriety in Minnesota politics. And tell us about who that was.
Sure, there was Paul Wellstone. So actually I was the one who convinced Paul he had to wear a tie to have a campaign. So he was just getting into politics, and
he was a professor from Carleton College,
yeah,
right?
Carleton College.
Had never run for office?
No, he'd been very active in nonprofit. So he helped group like Organization for a Better Rice County. He was involved in some of the power line protests and was just very active on environmental issues. So this was his first time to look at politics. Which
was 8 years, of course, before he subsequently went on to win election to the U.S. Senate representing Minnesota.
Yeah, and actually an interesting thing is that year in '82, Mark Dayton ran for the U.S. Senate and Paul Wellstone ran for state auditor. 8 years later, they switched which offices they ran for and were both elected.
Very good. Well, so let's talk about the nonprofit sector in Minnesota. How is the health of the nonprofit sector in our state right now? What's happening with nonprofits?
Well, it's actually been sort of gradual growth, even in the last recession. So if we look at what happened to employment, the period '08 to '10, Minnesota dropped 130,000 jobs in the business sector, and nonprofits grew by 4% at the same time. So it's actually nonprofits, they get their revenue partly from charitable contributions, partly government, partly earned income, and they turn out to be very stable employers overall.
And explain just for a second, what does that mean, earned income?
People paying fees, so could be paying to go to the theater or paying for tuition, paying for counseling or medical care. So, and nonprofits are active in all these areas of arts and culture, civic groups, education, health, human services. So it's a big variety of organizations.
And let's talk about MCN, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. When was MCN created, and really why was it created?
Well, it was, in a lot of ways, it's similar to a chamber of commerce. So in the same way that businesses join together to help educate the public or the legislature about the needs and perspectives of the business community, nonprofits found that even if they're in arts and environment groups are very different, but they both have volunteer boards, they both do individual fundraising, they rely on they want to comply with relevant laws. So they, even though they're different types of organizations, they have a lot in common. So so 25 years ago, the organization was formed basically to help advocate for a strong nonprofit sector and help strengthen these organizations and their boards and management.
And so approximately how many Minnesotans make their living working for nonprofits?
Yeah, it's about 250,000. So if you think of, you can divide the economy into three parts: business employers, government, and nonprofits. So business employers are 75% of the jobs, government is about 14%, and nonprofits 11%.
And Minnesota has been recognized. Many people around the country have looked to our state as really a leader in the development and growth of nonprofits. What do you think it is about our state that has made it fertile territory, if you will, for nonprofits to grow here and to thrive?
Well, it's, in some ways it's almost like Silicon Valley. They talk about the hothouse effect, is if you have a cluster of very high-performing organizations, then they sort of build off of one another. So whether it's skills of fundraising or having effective boards or volunteers, Minnesota now ranks at or near the top of almost every measure of charitable giving, corporate philanthropy, volunteering, and many people believe just high-performing organizations. Which
is really pretty remarkable, isn't it, John, when you consider that we're not a big mega state like a California or Texas or New York or Florida, that our population at about a little over 5 million people puts us sort of in the mid-range of states, and yet we have this nonprofit sector that is much bigger and much more influential in our community than that in many other states that are much bigger.
Yeah, it really does make Minnesota an outlier because, if we're the 21st largest state, Twin Cities' 16th largest metro area, you'd say, well, our nonprofits should rank between 16 and 21, whereas we have a lot of organizations that are in the top 5 in their field. And often these people are in leadership roles at the national level, and even the State Department, when they organize sort of international tours, if people are interested in the nonprofit sector, frequently they route them through Minnesota.
And you've had some international experience yourself, in addition to building the council here in Minnesota, working with nonprofits, not only in Minnesota but nationally. You've also had some international experience, haven't you?
Yeah, and partly having met people through these State Department exchanges. So spent time, especially Eastern Europe, where after the Berlin Wall fell, and sort of remaking and rebirth of democracy, people realized that successful market economies in a democracy will have some kind of a non-profit or non-governmental sector. So it's, and I think it's really now not just a U.S. phenomena, but this is a worldwide movement.
Right. One of the things that MCN does every year is you publish what's called the Nonprofit Economy Report, and actually I believe it was December that you came out with a sort of a year-end update on the state of nonprofits at the end of the year. And just quoting from that report, I thought this was interesting. During the prolonged economic downturn between 2007 and 2010, Minnesota businesses shed 6.9% of their employees, while the nonprofit workforce grew by 4.6%, adding stability to local economies. So my question for you is, is there an inverse relationship here too? Does this mean that as the economy begins to recover and stabilize, are we going to see nonprofits losing employees?
That's a good question. We haven't yet. So every year employment has gone up. It's possible that some of that increase was due to the stimulus funding. So like the community action programs had weatherization funding.
Right.
And some of that employment went away. But I would say overall, the transition to more of a service and information economy has been that's where the strength of the nonprofit sector is. So it seems like it's just part of a mature, healthy economy.
The Star Tribune every year publishes what they call the Nonprofit 100, and this came out in December, and it looks at the size of the nonprofit sector, looks at revenues or donations that they receive, and one of the issues they deal with also is compensation. And in looking at the most recent Nonprofit 100 that came out in December this past year, showed that the top 15 highest nonprofit salaries went to CEOs of health insurance, healthcare companies, or hospitals, and it ranged all the way from $770,000 for the CEO of UCare to $2.6 million for the CEO of Egan-based Blue Cross Blue Shield. Are you concerned that the public may be somewhat misled by surveys like this and get the idea that most nonprofit compensation is similarly as high as this, or maybe even excessive?
Yeah, I think it can be a problem, and people have mixed feelings about, well, if you're working for a nonprofit, you're working to make life better for other people, do you really need a high compensation? I would say in those cases, those giant healthcare organizations are really more similar to large corporations, and it is a competition for talent. So they're out sort of trying to hire people in the same fields. Whereas if we look at the regular human services or arts and culture or community organizations, yes, the compensation is much more modest and averages closer to $60,000 for top managers.
And you just touched on something I think is really important to consider just a moment ago when you said you have to compete for management expertise and talent. And when you think about it, I guess why would nonprofits be any less inclined than the for-profit sector or government to be trying to get the best leadership that they can for their organizations?
Right, you want to make sure that they're effective organizations, that they have quality financial information, that they're, quality employers and are complying with laws. So you need competent people. I think sometimes there is a wish that, well, if you're out to help other people, don't you get a lot of psychic income from that? You're doing the Lord's work, and perhaps your reward is not in this life, but in the next life. So, and certainly religious communities often have taken vows of poverty. Right. I think from the nonprofit perspective, we'd say, no, there's no reason why people doing this work, the same work in different types of organizations, should be paid differently. So if they're managing 25 employees, they should be paid like other people who manage similar enterprises.
Makes some sense. Let's talk about the issue of the tax status of nonprofits, because this is something, it's an issue that I know is often misunderstood by people in the public. And some of the impacts of having tax-exempt status. Recently, the Star Tribune had a story in which you were quoted, and it was noting that a number of cities, local governments, are rethinking the issue of tax-exempt status. And what we're talking about here is the tax exemption for property taxes paid by people who own property, obviously homeowners, but also paid by businesses and others. And as state and local government budgets have been stretched, frankly, to the breaking point, municipalities are looking more and more for ways to recover lost revenue, and they've set their sights on nonprofits. And just a couple of quick examples: in Boston, Massachusetts, they now require their biggest nonprofits collectively to pay millions of dollars a year in lieu of taxes, so-called payments in lieu of taxes. Right here, closer to home in Mankato in December, the City Council approved a measure requiring all property owners to fund city lighting on the streets of Mankato, not just property taxpayers, and obviously this would apply to nonprofits too. Bemidji and northern Minnesota and 17 other area townships are also looking at working to form a fire district and assessing all property owners, including nonprofits. You were quoted in the article as raising the question, where will this end? Where will it end?
It's not clear, and it may ultimately get to the state legislature to look at this. The history of this kind of property tax exemption partly goes back to England, and the concern was you donate money for a public benefit activity, and you don't want sort of the funds you contribute to be eaten up in taxation, so that if you donated money, say for an art park, it's possible that those organizations would end up going out of business because over time the contributions were taken up by taxes or fees. So in 1858, when Minnesota was formed as a state, our state constitution said organizations of purely public charity will be exempt from the property tax. And the idea was we didn't want to tax one public benefit activity to support another public benefit. So we wouldn't tax the fire department to pay for the police department. And in the same way, if you have sort of organizations that serve the poor or are undertaking medical research, you don't necessarily want to tax them because you don't want to discourage contributions to them. Mm-hmm. I think the cities certainly are under a lot of pressure, and I was glad to see in the governor's budget they have $120 million extra dollars for local government aid, which hopefully will help relieve that which problem. In recent years, local government aid, or as we call it, LGA, has been significantly cut. And many cities rely on that to help pay for some of those same basic services, police, firefighting, but also street lighting, street maintenance. Eagan doesn't receive LGA because it's a more affluent community, but many other communities in Minnesota do. So yeah, that may take a little bit of pressure off, but it could. And so I mean, some people compared it to rooting around under the sofa cushions
looking for
extra
coins,
change.
Spare change.
Yes, because in this case, the nonprofits, they're small organizations. They don't own a lot of property in most cases, and it'll be a big financial hit to them, but it's really not going to make much of a difference to the city budget because those city budgets are so much larger.
That's interesting. And there's another aspect of this unfolding debate that I found interesting. I did a little research on this, and I found out nonprofits aren't even the biggest tax-exempt group in Minnesota. That according to the state Minnesota Department of Revenue, 43% of non-taxable land is owned by government, by federal, state, or local government, and 22% is owned by schools. And yet it looks like the axe may be coming down on nonprofits. What is the impact of this if nonprofits are increasingly called upon to spend more money for these types of expenses? What does that do to nonprofit mission?
Well, it could come out of the classroom, if it's a school, or just less ability to provide services. So it really, varies organization by organization.
Or maybe less ability to keep the employees that they have. It could come down to that nonprofits could be forced to reduce hours or cut staff.
Yeah, it's just another expense, and it doesn't. And the problem is it doesn't really solve the problem for the city.
So what are some of the steps that you and MCN are taking right now in response to this activity?
Well, it's still in the conversation stage, but I'll say that there are some state legislators think that the best way would be to just have a statewide rule that cities can't take sort of the fees, sort of divide up every single activity in the city that had been supported by tax revenue and make it a fee. So the idea would be that don't sort of chop the city budget into 1,000 parts. Just keep the city budget intact.
Because it seems likely that something may happen at the state level, right? Because if you don't, what's to say that a dozen other communities may not resort to this tactic as well?
And that question of where does it end? Because people have discussed, well, a boulevard tree fee or snow removal fee, curb maintenance fee, street surface fees. Or you could have all these other fees attached to things that had been previously supported by just general tax revenues.
Right. In preparation for our conversation today, John, I did a little reading on a topic that I know is dear to your heart, the issue of social impact bonds, which is really a new term for a lot of people. People listening may not know what that is. What is a social impact bond?
The idea, and I would say there has been, well, this goes back to like the problem with city budgets, is there's a lot of services we'd like to have and a lot of activities, including to help people get jobs or reduce the number of people going back to prison or improve early childhood education. But there's just a limit to how much tax revenue there is. So if there was a way to capture new revenue or create savings, people would be for it. So the social impact bond was, the original proposal was in England, and the British government said that if an organization can reduce the number of people returning to the Peterborough prison, they will pay them an extra amount of money, and they will allow them to find private investors to pay for the costs of providing these services to prisoners who've been released.
Which otherwise government would be making that expenditure. They're relying on, the social impact bond is relying on identifying investors?
Yes. And these investors are speculating that the organization will be successful and that they will recoup their money at a end of this time when someone certifies that they've successfully, say, reduced recidivism by, say, 7%.
But it's really not a bond in the traditional sense we think of a bond, is it? Because normally when you talk about bond, you talk about a maturity date and a very specific outcome. It sounds like this is a little bit different from that, though, isn't it? Because it's more subjective?
Yeah, it probably would be better described as a social impact loan. Is that you're loaning money for this activity and then getting a return at the end.
I've seen it variously described also as a social benefit bond, or some have called it a pay-for-success bond. And the idea seems to have, as you mentioned, originated in the United Kingdom, came to the U.S., but it's also taken off a little bit in Australia. You've recently written a blog, though, where you raised some questions about the social impact bond, and basically it was responding to the idea that there's sort of a craze about this as a new way for addressing social problems by nonprofits without relying on government budgets to help them do that. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, and it is one of these ideas that sounds too good to be true. You know, if you could get better results and not have to put up any government money up front, why wouldn't you do it? So, you know, on that aspect, it's attracted a huge amount of attention. The interesting thing is that the Peterborough prison, that social impact bond, isn't completed yet. But
that was in the United Kingdom?
Yes. So this all started about 2 years ago. Then last year in 2012, City of New York created a bond with Goldman Sachs to do a similar thing with reduced recidivism of juvenile offenders at Rikers Prison.
Wasn't Mayor Bloomberg's foundation, the Bloomberg Foundation, also got involved in that?
Yes, and the interesting thing, they've guaranteed like 7 out of the 9 million, so it's very almost impossible for Goldman Sachs to lose money in this deal. And that deal is still pending, but now the Kennedy School of Government has issued a request, and I think they have like a week to go, saying they're putting out a call for states all over the country to get help to create these social impact bonds. So we still have yet to have a successful bond completed, and now it is a nationwide and even worldwide, almost a stampede.
Is there also a potential problem here that it really changes the relationship between donors and nonprofits in terms of expectations, that donors have tended to support nonprofit organizations because they believe in the work that organization is doing? But if I understand the idea behind the social impact bond, people who would put money up for this are expecting much more specific outcomes, which sometimes, actually maybe most times, are not really predictable. And is there a risk that we're robbing Peter to pay Paul? That we're taking money or pitting good causes against each other in competition for scarce money?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions like that. The question of unintended consequences is where does this head? And it's really not clear. But in this case, these aren't donors. These are investors, and so they're looking for a return. So there'll be a lot of pressure on each of these projects to deliver results. Mm-hmm. And part of what these social service and nonprofit groups rely on is having a trusting relationship between the people receiving the service at the local level and the organization. So this...
Is there a danger here, though, John? Do you think that some donors may look, generous donors may look and say, well, maybe I won't put as much money into this particular organization because they can go out and get a social impact bond? And could it curtail contributions? Is that possible?
Well, both that, and it could cause government to believe that there's a magic bullet out there, mm-hmm. and so it could end up with sort of a dislocation of funds of, well, why should we put money into this early childhood if we can put it into prison recidivism?
Mm-hmm. Reducing the incidence of people going back for reoffending. Yeah, very interesting. Well, is there some national research underway further exploring the impact of social impact bonds? Are you aware of any, or is that something that might happen someday from one of our academic think tanks? Or
hopefully there's people, because right now the academic think tanks are part of the cheering section.
Mm-hmm. So as you look at MCN as the CEO of this organization, we should have mentioned too, Council of Nonprofits has over 2,000 members mm-hmm. here in the state of Minnesota. What are your immediate goals for the year 2013 and looking a couple of years ahead? Where is MCN going to be positioned?
Well, we're helping nonprofits sort of tell their story at the legislative session and sort of making a case around, in many areas, like local government aid, there's been a lot of problems in the state budget and cutbacks. So organizations are looking for more stability and reliability in the state budget. And another set of activities, for the Council of Nonprofits is helping nonprofits make the best use of their funds. So we've actually helped create an insurance agency, Nonprofit Insurance Advisors, to make sure nonprofits have the right type of insurance, are educated about risks, and are able to save money if possible. Mm-hmm.
And we should mention to our viewers too, you yourself have played a leadership role nationally, frequently writing articles for the Chronicle of Philanthropy, other academic journals, and you're recognized as one of the leading experts in the country on the nonprofit sector, which is something I think all of us here in Minnesota can be proud of.
Well, thanks, Steve. Well, and partly I would say Minnesota's nonprofit sector in general has a big leadership role in the U.S. and really even in other countries, of helping sort of display and demonstrate what the nonprofit sector can do to improve a community.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us today, John. I know there's a lot more that we could talk about, so that just simply means we're going to have to get you back on the show one of these days. But it's certainly been a pleasure having you on. Jon Pratt, Executive Director of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, my former employer, still my friends and former colleagues. Congratulations on your leadership of this great organization and the great work you do. Thanks for being on Access to Democracy.
Thank you, Steve.